Welcome to Paulina's Pages. Today the entire video is dedicated to A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. As you can see, I'm currently displaying a list of contents that will be included in this video. There's a lot to get through, but before we begin, I need to say this video is fun. If you're new to my channel, every video I get a literary pun. I read this book about Mount Everest. It was a real cliffhanger. I want to briefly introduce Virginia Woolf as a person to you. So she was born in England in 1882 and died in 1941, and she was actually born into a wealthy family, except her mother died when she was around 13, so she was still quite young, and a number of family members followed her mother. So in quick succession there were a lot of people in her family who died, and this led to what is considered Virginia Woolf's first depressive episode. Her movement or style of writing was modernism, and she wrote both fiction and essays. And some of her notable works include To the Lighthouse, Orlando, Miss Dalloway, and A Room of One's Own. So these are just the key facts about her life, and of course there's more that you can find out about the individual. There's plenty of articles on the internet. Today I'm mostly talking about A Room of One's Own and sharing my thoughts on it and exploring some of the themes. So I will be glazing over her bio, and to admit that transition was quite smooth. So let's take a look at what life was like in the 20th century when Virginia Woolf was alive. And A Room of One's Own was published in 1929. And actually 20th century Britain had a lot of things going on, so this is kind of a large section, but feel free to skip over to the next one. If I figured out how to do the timestamps, they should be in the description. So 1914 to 1918 was the First World War. Then in 1930s there was the Women's Rights Movement. 21st of November 1918, Act 1918 was passed that allowed women to be elected into Parliament. In 1928, women in England, Wales, and Scotland were allowed to vote on the same terms as men, which was basically you had to be over the age of 21. While women could only vote in 1928, the majority of men in Britain could vote way before. But in 1897, before all of this, there were local groups of women demanding the right to vote, and they formed the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was acronymed as the NUWSS. Members were the suffragists, and they were not to be confused with the suffragettes who came a bit later in 1903 when Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, and their motto was deeds, not words. And they were a radical organization campaigning for women to be allowed rights, and they actually committed quite a lot of crimes like arson. They planted bombs as part of their campaigns. The suffragists campaigned peacefully, the suffragettes campaigned violently, and they actually had to pause their campaigning because the First World War began. None of the WSPU stopped campaigning during the war. What happened after the war to help women get the right to vote? Because women had helped in the war and the politics acknowledged that they helped, there was a growing support for women to get the vote, and actually growing support for women to have more equal terms in general. But also that was the nice kind of reason. There was also a big fear of the suffragette movement starting again, and there has been a public outcry about the punishment that the suffragettes had gone through, like force feeding after they went on a hunger strike. That, and actually quite a couple other factors, women finally got the right to vote. A Room of One's Own is a short read, but it's definitely one of the most fascinating books that I've read in my life. But I will be talking more about my thoughts on the book when I review it in the review section. So the book was written when Virginia Woolf was asked to give a lecture on women and fiction. And this short read, and it only consists of 6 chapters, and it's basically slightly less than 40,000 words. So I just want to go over the 2 main points that are expressed throughout the chapters. The main point made, kind of the thesis of this essay, women need time and space and money to write. Also that women's voices as writers have been silenced, and it's time for them to be heard, which is why it's considered feminist, because it was empowering women against the oppression of women must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. The quote from chapter 1 is probably the most famous line of the entire piece, and it's also the essay's thesis because everything after is based around this idea. And the second point is, to be a good writer, you need to be androgynous, which means having both male and female parts. And she says that that is because your biases, you as a female can have biases against males, and the same goes the other way around. And she also talked a lot about how men's portrayal of women, and how even though the majority of literature was written by men at the time, and women actually did play a central role in quite a couple pieces, like there were women characters there, they weren't exactly written accurately, and no man or male author that she read agreed fully on what women were like. So she says that in order to not be biased and write without that kind of tint overshadowing your writing, you need to be androgynous. I know that was very brief because I've only kind of condensed it into 2 main points, but I do explore more of it later on in the video. And actually, I think it's beneficial for you to read the book yourself as well. So if you're doing this for school, then read the book as well, because I don't think you will regret it. It's honestly a fantastic book. If that's on my required reading, then I'm going to be quite happy to read it again. And now let's talk about Obviously, there's a lot covered in this work that you can find out more about, but I'm currently displaying the themes that are most interesting to me. I didn't want to make this video too long, so I just picked 3 themes that I found particularly fascinating. Themes that I picked were the need to create, men's portrayal of women, and women relationships in literature. We've already spoken about how crucial Woolf considers it for a woman to have a room of her own and money and time to write. And she also says how it's no wonder that women are considered hysterical because they don't have an outlet to express herself. And one of the most famous metaphors that she makes is that of Shakespeare's sister, imaginary sister that she makes up, Judith, who doesn't have an education. She barely has the time for writing. She doesn't have the resources. Her family aren't encouraging her, and as a woman, it's harder to make it for her in the literary world because it's expected of her that she will just sit there, marry, and have children. So Judith chooses suicide over an uneventful and unfulfilling life. Judith is massively overlooked, which is also another reason that she commits suicide, because she doesn't feel appreciated in this world. And I love this quote that Virginia Woolf says about Judith, and I think it's quite an inspirational one in regard to how art lives on. So Woolf comes back to this metaphor of Judith a lot, and you can find a lot of other videos on the internet reading out this exact passage or explaining more about why exactly she chose Judith. But honestly, I think it was the perfect example to choose because it makes it very clear for the reader. And I think we can all realize that yes, if Shakespeare really had a sister who wrote, she would probably not be talked about right now. And please pause and read the quote that I'm about to display. Now, let's come back to the idea of that androgynous mind and that you need to neither be a woman or a man to write. And I think a good example of this was the way that she described how men portrayed women. So there was this scene where Virginia was sitting in the library and she was taking all these books to put on the table because she was doing the research for writing the essay. So she had all these books in front of her and she picked one up and she started reading it, and it said one thing about women, and then she finished it and she picked up another one and it said a completely different thing. And all of these men in her pile, because it was mostly men who were writing, so all the books that she picked, they were mostly men writing about women. All of them contradicted each other. No one could agree on what women looked like. No one could agree on a portrayal of women. And she says that it would probably be the same with women, because if a female author was to write, then she would feel the anger of being oppressed through the ages, so she would portray men differently than they could potentially be acting at the time. And she says that the time has not yet come when we can say for certain which is the man and which the woman, after both have boarded the taxi of human personality. And the final theme that I want to explore in Woolf's writing is her commentary on the relationships of women. And I think she makes a good point that when she was reading, there wasn't a book that she could find where there were women who were friends. Most of the emotions they experienced were jealousy or rivalry or perhaps sisters, but there weren't any real friendships between women. She also has a scene where she talks about Chloe and Olivia, and she checks a cupboard for a man because she doesn't feel safe to talk in the presence of a man. Comments a little on lesbians, calls to start including women in literature and also explore their emotions, because women have complex emotions. It's not just jealousy, it's not hysterics that she comes back to, because that's often how men portray women. As for the relationships of women to be recognized and acknowledged and to be written and encouraged to be there in books. So this is something that literary critics have said before, and I definitely agree that stepping inside her books was like overlooking an internal monologue, and a lot of people complained that it kind of seemed rambling to them, but I loved the way the time flowed in this book. I absolutely adored it because we all think a similar way. Like, we write differently, but when we think, for example, when I'm thinking what to say right now, my thoughts are going kind of the one direction that I am directing in talking about this book, but they're also going another direction to talk about, for example, why that is, and you're always thinking inside your mind, and it always goes in different directions. It goes back to something you've experienced before, and I loved how it was so personal and so close, and honestly you couldn't stop reading it and annotating it. And I also loved the length of it. I think it was the perfect length because it was so brief, yet at the same time you're devouring it and you're annotating everything. And I also love that Virginia Woolf leaves space for there to be counter arguments against what she says. But at the same time, even if you don't agree with something, I think you would still enjoy reading this book because it's well written, and I love the way that everything is represented in here. It's about a great deal of themes, and I love the way it links them, and we have this kind of personal experience and scholarly experience. I definitely agree that for someone to write, they need a space of their own to focus and time to focus on what they're writing. And even though times have changed since Virginia Woolf, I still think that it applies to what we have today. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of inequality, which is what feminists are trying to address. And I think what Woolf meant by this room is that she just wants women to have the freedom to write and do anything other than have children. I think it's a valid point, because with men now we have this idea of masculinity still, and I think that there's a couple of families that if they saw their son writing poetry, they would say that it was an unmanly thing to do, and they would discourage him from writing it, and we would lose a great poet. But for women, it is still, if you're dedicating time to writing instead of dedicating time to finding a husband or having children, then you are wasting your time as a woman. And I think having a room would really be crucial, and we would raise a generation of amazing writers, both female and male. I also agree that you need something to financially support you to have more chance of success, and of course creative motivation plays a part in it. But for example, if you as an artist are drawing and you have all these ideas in your head, but you for example need stone and to build a statue, and you don't have the resources to buy stone and a chisel to make the statue out of stone, you are limited. And it is crucial to be financially independent for you to have that ability to build what you want. And actually Virginia Woolf had an aunt that left her a rich inheritance so that Virginia had the time to write, and she comments on that as well. To succeed creatively, you need skill, obviously, and to have skill you need practice, and to have practice you need time, which is relevant, but it also applies to money, because if you're working, really going to have that much time to work on your creative ability. Where Virginia says that money is a good to have with you when you're working on your creativity. She has been accused of being classicist, and I disagree. He is just acknowledging that our society relies heavily on money, and it's unfair to accuse her of doing so, because I think that she's just merely pointing out that even though creative motivation is important factors, it's not just money, but money still plays a role. Virginia Sophia said, and I want to quote again, "I understand that the first duty of a lecturer to hand you after an hour's discourse a nugget of pure truth to wrap up between the pages of your notebooks and keep on the mantelpiece forever." And I wanted to say thank you so much for staying until the end to see this part. I hope you liked it, and this is now a new segment that I am introducing, and from November on, every Thursday I am going to dive deep and analyze more books. Please make sure to follow and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss videos when they start coming out again. Hope you like this video, and I'll see you next week.